Good morning, everybody, and welcome to IGTV. With us, the weekly editorial, William H. Murray, and the topic this week is going to be computer forensics. William Murray, take it away.
I've been thinking about talking about forensics for a while, but our local program on the subject last week tipped me over the edge. By definition, forensics is that which is of interest to a court. The word is rooted in Latin, and more specifically to the Roman forum, the court, from which forensics took its name. Until late in the 19th century, and to some extent as late as my youth, the word referred to rhetoric, the telling of the story by the advocates and witnesses. Today, the word forensics is most often used as short for forensic science, the application of the scientific method to investigation and evidence. Almost all branches of science have some application to investigation and evidence, with specialty practitioners in those areas, even things as remote as astronomy and meteorology. Not only is computer science not an exception to this rule, but today most investigations rely upon it to some extent or other. In the early days, before displays and disk drives, the records were kept sequentially on magnetic tape and printed out on continuous form paper for use. While the data was mutable on tape, we were really using the ink on paper to run the business. It was this that we were most likely to submit as evidence. Now, I've been in the information technology long enough to have watched the shift in business records from primarily ink on paper, with a few digital exceptions, to bits on magnetic media, with the representation of those bits as ink on paper as the exception. However, in modern forensics, we may use e-paper. For example, PDFs, TIFFs, and JPEGs. Digital representations of the image or appearance of a record in which the bits are bound to each other in such a way as to resist later modification and ensure that any modification will be obvious. While in practice most courts give credence to written records, the law still gives deference, if not preference, to the first-person testimony of witnesses. All else is called hearsay and is suspect. When courts first began to give credence to written records, it was only to public records, those kept by the church and municipalities, not to business records. Most use of computer records is under the business record exception to the hearsay rule. The assumption behind this exception is that if the record is good enough to run the business, then it is good enough for the court to consider as evidence. However, in weighing the probative value of these records, the court will consider when and how the records were made. For example, were they made routinely, in the normal course of business, contemporaneous with the events they describe, by someone whose job it was to make them, and who is available to testify as to their provenance and authenticity. Much of what forensic investigators do addresses the authenticity of the records, their freedom from interference, contamination, or modification. As security people, we tend to think of forensics in the context of criminal investigation and prosecution. However, as we learned last week, in practice, this use is dwarfed by its use in civil litigation, in what is called litigation support. While criminal investigation usually involves relatively small amounts of structured data, civil investigations often involve large quantities of unstructured data. While the parties and their attorneys may know the properties of the relevant data, it will only rarely be arranged, sorted, or indexed by those properties. The investigators may have to go through large quantities of irrelevant data to discover the relevant. This is reflected in the change in our tools over the last few years. As recently as 5 or 6 years ago, our principal tool was EnCase. Remember EnCase? A tool for capturing any evidence on a disk drive while preserving its authenticity and provenance. Implicit in our use of this tool was the assumption that the drive was on the origin or destination machine of a hack. We also relied heavily on operating system event logs. In the presentations that we heard last week, there was only one mention of NCAS, and that was just in passing. Instead, we heard about dozens of new tools that enable us to recognize, identify, index, bind, and present evidence from large quantities of unstructured data. Of course, in addition to authenticity and relevance, the court will apply other tests, for example, materiality, to decide whether or not evidence is admissible. However, most of that will be up to the lawyers rather than to the investigators. Notice that I've been careful to use the word investigator to describe the role of security people in forensics. That is in part because not all security professionals are qualified investigators. As an example, I teach forensic science, but I do not offer my services as an investigator. I do not have sufficient experience. Most of us are qualified and useful to assist in an investigation, but fewer of us are qualified to lead one. Most of those who are qualified to lead an investigation have years of full-time experience doing so. As professionals, we are responsible to know the limits of our knowledge, skills, and abilities, and when to call a specialist. So whenever I'm confronted with an investigation, I'm going to call on people like Verizon, their data breach investigation services, Mandiant for advanced persistent threat. I'm going to call on Kroll for criminal investigations. I'm going to call on Deloitte and their forensic practice and the forensic practices of all the other big four if I have something like an Enron. In addition to our role as investigators, after an event, security professionals may play an advisory role in advance of an event, an example, a breach or a fraud, in which we advise our clients on how to keep records in such a way as to maintain or to maximize the effectiveness and efficiency of investigations and to ensure the compliance of the enterprise with the demands of the court. For example, in 2006, the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure were revised to say that such communications as instant messaging, email, or even social media might be subject to discovery, and that organizations that could not comply with a discovery order for such records might be held guilty of spoliation and subject to penalties ranging from adverse inferences to fines or even to incarceration for contempt. Our jobs also include ensuring that our principals are aware of the rules and helping them weigh the cost of additional record keeping against any potential for such penalties. Similarly, we must help them weigh the cost of indexing and managing documents in advance against that of discovering to comply with a court order late. A highlight of our presentations last week was that by KPMG on their Fraud and Misconduct Survey 2010. You should all go out and take a look at this. There's a great deal of information. Keep in mind that this is a survey. It's not based upon a population of cases. But this report validated much of what we know anecdotally about fraud. Insiders, managers and executives, high cost, found late. The report even suggested that the majority of frauds, particularly by upper-level executives, the ones that are costly, are discovered by accident. I think what's happening is that our controls are working pretty good against the tellers. They're not working so well against loan officers. Forensics is an important part of what we do, whether early or late. Accountability is the test of how well we do it. If we can fix accountability for every significant event to the level of an individual, both when things are working as designed and intended, and in the face of error and malice, then we have earned the right to be called professionals and to be paid the big bucks. See you next week.
Thanks, Bill. I appreciate it. Just had to turn the microphones back on there. I try and douse things while you're talking. Excellent presentation, and certainly I would agree with you. Knowing the limits of your expertise is very important, and being able to dig into the various pots where there is expertise out there is equally as important. And you name some good examples and ways of doing that, and people would be foolhardily to dig into things without actually getting the expertise out there. When you get a chance, if you can post that KPMG link for that report, if you have it, that would be nice, and then I'll put that out as a tweet.
Very good.
All right, thank you, sir.
See you next week.
All right, everybody.